you've probably discovered this already, but you just can't argue with some climate activists. In this case, with these zombies today protesting. The Wallabies team that's now off to the World Cup in France has just renewed its sponsorship with Santos, that produces gas for wicked things like heating and electricity. Have I told you how much I loathe street theatre?
Unfortunately, the dead wallabies could not find any brains in Canberra this morning because the government is still beholden to fossil fuel companies destroying our climate.
But it's not just the zombies that you can't reason with. You're also being lied to on global warming by the people you should actually trust and that can speak. They have a problem. Their global warming policies are now hurting you much more than global warming itself. Electricity prices, just for a start. Oh, and the vandalism now, the wrecking of our landscape with massive wind turbines and transmission lines. And so to make you accept all this harm, the politicians are ramping up the fear. They say, oh, global warming is going to be even worse. I mean, it's causing more disasters, they say, more disasters than you've ever seen before. Unnatural disasters.
Our beautiful land has always been subject to natural disasters, but those disasters are becoming increasingly devastating, increasingly frequent, increasingly unnatural.
How often do you hear that claim now? I mean, this fear-mongering is now stepping up too. Last week, the head of the United Nations, for instance, said climate breakdown has begun, more climate chaos. And yesterday, America's Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration claimed, well, the US had just had the all-time highest number of billion-dollar disasters, 23 confirmed year to date. But is any of that true? I was joined earlier by Dr. Roger Pielke Jr., Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Now, he was for years, or has for years, studied the damage from climate-related disasters. I would call him a world expert. Professor Pielke, first, thank you so much for joining us, but let's get clear that you're not what's dismissed as a denier or a skeptic. You don't doubt the world is warming. You don't doubt there's a threat there. Your concern is people exaggerating and making false claims. Is that correct?
That's right. Climate change is real. It's serious. I've been advocating for policies in response for almost 30 years. But at the same time, we need to be faithful to what science can and can't say and simply be honest with where the research is at.
All right. So let's get into that. The United Nations, for instance, predicted that we would get a 40% increase in disasters between 2015 and 2030, so still 7 years to go. Do you believe them?
That's an unfortunate abuse of statistics. They took a data set that shows an increase in disasters because of better reporting around the world from the 1970s, and they drew a line through it and extended it to 2030. The reality is that since 2000, the number of global disasters has been flat or slightly declining, which is really good news. It means that the world is doing better with respect to disasters. Disasters require a combination of an exposed population, vulnerability, and an extreme event. So when we look for trends in climate, we should always look at climate data, not disaster data.
And yet this is a very popular meme. I mean, part of it is, of course, the media. You know, we're also wired up so that a fire in Greece that you wouldn't have known about 40 years ago is now, you know, in your face on the TV news or on the internet. But you've got bodies like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States today claiming, but listen, the US has just had the all-time highest number of billion-dollar disasters on record. And it strikes me that when they say that, they're pulling a trick that you've been warning against for years.
Yeah, we shouldn't use economic data to say anything about climate change. If you take a look, for example, at the U.S., the largest disasters are caused by hurricanes, which strike the very populated East and Gulf Coast. There's many more buildings, many more people, much more property. So, of course, even with the same number of extreme weather events, we're going to have more billion-dollar disasters. If you want to look at trends in climate, we always should be looking at climate data, not economic data. It makes for good headlines, but it's not good science.
Now, like I suggested, you know, we're seeing TV reports of fires in Canada, fires in Greece in roads, and now floods in Greece. So putting it all together, people get this idea that we're being overwhelmed by climate disasters suddenly. But you've actually plotted, you mentioned this before, but you've plotted climate-related disasters around the world this century. From your graphic, I don't see a trend, but like many people are going to have trouble believing that after all these headlines. How do you come to this conclusion?
Yeah, this is a data set that's kept by a group in Belgium, and they have quantitative criteria, number of people killed, dollar damage, number of people displaced, and they track that data, and they have done so for decades with support from the U.S. government. And they say that their data is more or less complete since 2000. And so that data set says what it says. And I know that there's a lot of media attention paid to disasters these days. But again, we need to be systematic and look at evidence, not at headlines or news stories, to understand what's actually going on with disasters.
But it's hard to not be impressed if you're not following the news carefully when you've got, say, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, saying the climate breakdown, the world is now boiling, et cetera, and yet when you dig down at the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, do they actually make the link between climate disasters and global warming as strongly as he does?
Yeah, 30 years ago, governments around the world came together and created the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to assess the vast literature on climate science, climate impacts, climate economics. And their most recent report concluded that, yes, indeed, there are a few extremes that have increased and can be attributed to human causes, and notably heat waves and also extreme precipitation. But most other extremes, tropical cyclones, flooding, meteorological or hydrological drought, do not show those signs. So while it's very easy to put out press releases and make strong statements, it's a little bit more difficult, but always more rewarding to go a little bit deeper into what the UN science assessments say. And again, the literature says what it says, and it's important just to understand that and be accurate when we represent that data.
Professor Spielke, when you're talking about increased rainfall, of course, for a continent like Australia, that's actually good news. Sometimes it seems to me that with warming, all the bad is exaggerated, the good is ignored. Here's one thing. I've seen a graphic plotting deaths against rising temperature, and I'm showing audiences that the viewers, the red line over the past century is rising temperature. And then against that, you see the death rate. The world is warming, Professor, but the death rate is plummeting. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the world, this is one of the great success stories of science, technology, and policy of the last 50 years, is that as nations have become richer around the world, they've also become better able to cope with extreme events. And again, don't look for signals of climate change in human impacts. We are a very inventive, very clever species, and there are places such as the Bay of Bengal where there used to be tens of thousands of deaths every year, sometimes hundreds of thousands due to typhoons. And now there's warning systems, there's evacuation protocols in place. It's a really impressive success story, but it's something that's quite different than climate change. And we should not expect to see a signal of climate change in disaster deaths.
Yes, my point isn't that. My point is more addressing this fear that seems out of control, particularly among the young, that as the planet warms, they're even more likely to die. You've got people saying, oh, how can I bring a child into this world? Or we won't live till we're 50. The world human society is going to collapse. I'm not seeing that in the data, are you?
Yeah, I mean, earlier today I met with my class of college students here in Colorado, and that sentiment of being afraid, fearful of the future because of concern about climate change is grounded in a lot of media representations, fictional representations, movies, even celebrities. It's not grounded in an understanding of the science and the data. So climate change is real, of course, but it's not apocalyptic and it's not the end of the world. And so understanding that there's a big gap between denying and extreme alarmism is I think, very important for young people to understand.
Professor Roger Pielke, thank you so much for joining us, and I should recommend viewers to pick up your writings on Substack, which is, really informative. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Andrew.